Hello and welcome back to the Trinity Student Managed Fund podcast. I'm your host, Matthew Barnes, and today my guest is Mr. Julian Coulter. Julian is the Global Managing Director for Food, Beverages and Restaurants at Google, based in Chicago, where he leads Google's worldwide operations for the sector. He has spent 7 years at Google, most recently as Managing Director for Mexico and previously for Peru. Julian's career has been built largely across emerging markets. He left Ireland in 1996 after graduating from Trinity College Dublin, moving to Warsaw 2 years later, and by the age of 26, he was running Poland, Russia, the Czech Republic and Slovakia for Britvic International. He then took an MBA at Harvard, moved to South Africa with South African Breweries, and later became the president of marketing for SAB Miller in Peru. In this conversation, we talk about the challenges and opportunities of operating in emerging markets and why he chose the more volatile path. We get into the assault of Chinese retailers Shein and Temu on the market share of Mercado Libre and Amazon in Latin America, the strategies they employ and how Western companies have retained share. We talk about reverse innovation, why the strongest ideas increasingly travel from emerging markets into developed ones, whether artificial intelligence will widen or close the gap between the developed world and emerging markets, and how to identify and take asymmetric opportunities in your own career. Thank you, Julian, for coming on. So, Julian, can you take me back to your upbringing, your time at Trinity? What did you study? What were you interested in? And how did that set you up for what came next?
Yeah. Well, thanks, Matthew. Thanks for having me here. Real pleasure. Nice to connect with somebody back at Trinity College. I studied in Trinity from 1992 to 1996. I studied BESS, Business Economics Social Studies, focusing more on the economics and business side of the curriculum. Had 4 fantastic years in college, made some lifetime friends, was part of some fantastic clubs and have a lot of great memories. Was delighted to get back actually this May for my 30-year reunion, which is quite unbelievable to think of how fast that time has passed. But it was great also to connect with a bunch of people from my class I hadn't seen for a long period of time.
Looking to the early days of your career, I mean, you spent a lot of time in South America, Mexico, and Peru with Google. And what took you there, I suppose, first of all, and what did operating in those markets teach you?
I've always had this, I think, desire or attraction to work in developing markets. It actually goes back further. After I finished college, I only spent about 1.5 years in the UK. When I left in 1996, there were very few jobs in Ireland. It was actually something that for the vast majority of people, didn't even look at or consider. From my class, I would say a good 75% emigrated upon graduation. I went to the UK, worked for Bass Brewers on their graduate scheme for about 1.5 years, and then looked for opportunities to work elsewhere. And I had an opportunity to go and work in Poland. This was in 1998, so not too far after the fall of communism. And just to work at that time in such a dynamic market where growth rates were double figures, where there was endless opportunity, versus a mature market, it was something that really appealed to me, where it just felt more agile, it felt more entrepreneurial, it felt more dynamic. So I think that has been very much ingrained in what I've done since then. I got the bug having worked there in Poland and also doing some work in Czech Republic at the time and in Russia. Very similar markets in terms of stages of development. And I think that then transcended further on later in my career when I had a chance to go and work in South Africa. And from South Africa, then across to Latin America, to Peru and Mexico, as you rightly say. All markets in ways of development to varying degrees, but the upside was a lot larger. It's not often you see in beer markets or in soft drink markets the ability to grow, between 8 and 12, 13% year on year, which was very often the case in these markets. And I found that a lot more stimulating than working in more mature markets such as the UK. So I think that was probably one of the driving forces.
I suppose how did your experiences differ from those who maybe went towards, London or America, somewhere that was a bit more mature? Would you say it was a more exciting experience? I know you mentioned it was a bit more agile.
Look, I had a lot of friends who went. Also, I think it depended on the track or the path you took. As I mentioned, I worked for Bass Brewers. Bass Brewers at the time was the biggest brewer in the UK. The Bass Triangle, you may be familiar with, the first registered trademark in the world. So working for them initially in the Midlands as a sales graduate, I was a sales guy on the road, sales rep, which was fantastic learning ground, having to go to service 80 pubs, restaurants, and hotels. And a lot of these pubs were pretty much at the edge. We were visiting the rough side of Leicester, going to a pub where you know that the decisions you're taking in terms of what you're selling in, if that doesn't sell out for that owner, you're putting his livelihood at risk, because cash flow for many of these tenants and pub owners was very tight. So I think it gave you a lot of responsibility at a very young age, 22, on your shoulders to take these decisions to ensure that you were selling in products that they could actually sell out. But my biggest, I think, differential versus a lot of my friends who went to work for investment banks and consulting companies in London, I noticed that when I moved from the Midlands down to London in 1998, and I was working just as hard as they were. But I remember one Saturday morning going to NatWest to take out money from the ATM, and I was overdrawn. And for me, that was a real tipping point. It was a spark in my head that said, really, I'm working this hard and I don't even have enough money to go out tonight to have some food and some beers. Something has to change. Because even at that stage, I was on a much lower salary than what they were getting in consulting or investment banking terms, right? So they could go out and in Battersea or Clapham and go to Clapham Grand and have a fun time, but being left behind wasn't that appealing. So that was also, I think, one of the biggest differences that I noticed in those early days, which was, look, I got to think about this differently for my chosen route. I don't want to do consulting right now. I'm not interested in finance at this point. So how can I make this a success? Thinking a little bit outside the box and doing something a bit differently to others that is going to hopefully get me an accelerated path to where I want to get to in the future.
Could you tell us how you went about that? What were those next steps, looking at that accelerated path?
Look, at that point in time, I had just moved across from Bass Brewers, was the owner of Britvic soft drinks. So Britvic would have the brands you may know, Robinson's, the waters. It had Tango, and also it was the largest Pepsi franchise outside of the US. So it had all Pepsi brands, Pepsi, 7-Up, et cetera, et cetera. And I got to work for Britvic International in 1998, and I was traveling to Poland every week for launch of Tango in the Polish market. And that's when I was living in London. And I just proposed on that Monday to my boss, just say, look, you're spending a lot of money for me to go back and forth Mondays to Fridays. I'm not particularly enjoying living in London. Why can't I do this job from the franchisees' offices in Warsaw? You save some money, or actually you probably come out in the wash between paying rent for me versus what we're paying in 4 flights a month. And if you're willing for me to get some Polish lessons, I'm willing to learn the language and ensconce myself in Warsaw. So that was something I think very different. Nobody else from Britvic International had ever proposed for themselves to go and work in market. But it helped me a lot for a couple of reasons. Firstly, I had the chance to learn Polish in very quick time, because when you're working all day with a franchisee, when many people didn't speak good English, when you're out on the road with sales reps, you have to learn the language. When you're visiting mom and pop stores, they don't speak English. You had to learn Polish. So there was very much a driving force for me to learn the language. And once I cracked that, it opened up so many opportunities, but also drove my credibility with the franchisee. They saw this guy is taking it seriously. He's moving out here. He's moved to our country. He's learned the language. And that opened a lot of doors for me to work with a franchisee in a much deeper manner than those who would come out to visit from London, who they would treat very differently. And that gave me a very strong trajectory within Britvic International, because they also saw the dedication and they saw the sacrifices that I had made. And at that point in time, I became the regional director for Britvic International at the age of 26, managing Russia, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, which are the main markets. And that was a fantastic story for me then to then go and springboard to do my MBA in the US, because I had chosen that different track and I had taken very deliberate choices to do so, to try to differentiate myself from others.
I suppose digging into the kind of emerging market theme throughout your career, I know you, jumping ahead a little, you spent a lot of time in Peru with Google, and Peru have a central bank which has been praised a lot for stability despite some kind of a lot of political changes. I don't know if that's something that played on your mind, and was the presence of that reliable kind of central bank there kind of affecting the way you guys were able to operate with a little more stability?
Not really. I think more, Matthew, working for SAB Miller, when I went to Peru, initially I worked for SAB Miller. That was African breweries, when they then merged with Miller Brewing Company in the US. And I think the South Africans had this, well, obviously you go right back to the vote tracker days of South Africans. They have this desire to travel. They have this desire to be very much at the zeitgeist or at the leading edge of what's happening, across disparate markets. They adjusted very well to developing markets as well, much more so than I think people who came from more comfortable backgrounds in the US or UK. They were able to expand very quickly into Hungary, Russia, the whole of Africa. They pretty much took over Latin America. They purchased breweries in Colombia, in Panama, in Peru. So the stability that was provided by SAB Miller as this multi-billion-dollar company, and then secondly, working in a market where SAB Miller had 99% market share, that was more so the backbone of the stability that I was looking for, because I knew I was being backed by a big player. Anheuser-Busch InBev at the time only had 1% share. Subsequently talked to the post-merger between SAB Miller and Anheuser-Busch in 2016. I talked to my counterpart. I was CMO of SAB Miller of Peru. He was CMO of Anheuser-Busch InBev at 1%. And he had it very tough. He had a lot more fragility. He had a lot more uncertainty as to his position. His route to market was very much challenged, because when you dominate the market 99%, you have all the route to market. You've got all the contracts with the major players. You own the transportation and logistics through to the mom and pop stores. It's very, very hard for you to break through. So the central bank component, no, not really, because I think one lesson that I've learned from working in developed markets is that you have to be able to roll the punches. You have to be able to know and understand that you are going to have volatility, and you're going to have good quarters and bad quarters based on the vagaries of the market, because you're going to have shocks. I think Argentina is a supreme example of that. If you actually look at the last 30, 40, 50 years of Argentina, it's nearly a 10-year decade wave of waves and troughs that they go through, which in itself is quite ironic that there's such volatility, but actually such consistency in the manner that happens. So I think I learned to manage volatility early in my career, and something I was able to embrace and not let it affect me. It then, vis-a-vis having worked in a more stable market, I think it would have been a lot more difficult to have made that transition and adjustment to Peru.
You mentioned there's a lot of these ups and downs working in emerging markets. Are there any that really spring out to you across your career? Maybe some time from the kind of ex-Soviet republics, or maybe in Latin America or South Africa? What was some of the biggest kind of challenging periods that you faced?
I would say in Poland, trying to launch Tango as a premium drink in a market where I look back at it now, hindsight is always fantastic, right? But Tango at that point in time was famous in the UK for the, I don't know, Matthew, before your time, the famous slap commercial. Does that ring a bell for you?
Unfortunately not, no.
You can YouTube it after. It was famous. The guy drinks the Tango, and then some guy with a big orange face comes up behind him and he slaps him on the side of the face. It actually became an issue in the schoolyard that the education ministry had to stop it being played out in the schoolyards. So Tango at the point in time was killing Fanta in the UK. So on the back of this success, they thought we're going to take it internationally. They did a study with a consulting firm, and they recognized Poland because of many of those points that I mentioned earlier on. It was growing. It was a new market. They would lack a premium offering in the market. But there were some things. It was also presented in a black PET bottle, and that was not researched well. Black PET in pre-communist Poland was highly correlated to medicines. So there was this sort of inherent understanding of black bottles being medicinal, which wasn't great trying to sell a soft drink. The marketing investment budget was too low. I think the research was done at that point in time, it was more TV. It was probably 95% TV spend. This was pre-digital time. There were only two or three channels that helped to drive the reach and frequency and penetration that was required, but the actual budget investment dollars was too low. The type of commercial wasn't good. And all these things, I think I realized them, but I was too young to challenge them. I felt, if I'm honest, simplicity, I'm 25. What do I know versus my 50-year-old boss who's done this for the last 25 years? But I was the one left with the fallout of that, trying to launch a premium brand in Poland that was hitting 10, 15% of its targets on a monthly, quarterly basis, and trying to turn it around through more and more desperate measures, by then starting to price cut. And as soon as you start doing that, you lose the premiumization. And eventually, after about 18 months, Tango was pulled from the market. So a lot of lessons. And again, I think that was one of the things which I mentioned earlier, working with the franchisee, having been able to speak Polish, I was a lot more aware of the actual way to win in the market, because I was living there with them and I was understanding their way of doing business versus those in their ivory towers coming over from London on a plane once every quarter, asking why the numbers are so poor, who had absolutely zero understanding of the true ways of the market and how it operated. So a lot of lessons that I would have and have taken forward into my career later, which is to challenge early and to be very, very much watertight on the strategy and understanding what your North Star is, irrespective of the sector.
How much does that issue arise where you're the guy on the ground in this region and you understand the market, you understand the ways of doing business, but there's going to be tension maybe between what the headquarters or what those in the ivory towers, as you say, want you to do. How do you kind of deal with that tension and go about it? How much deference is there to you, the guy on the ground?
Well, look, I think you've got to try to land it in objective viewpoints. So something that I subsequently learned, and I was very lucky with my time in South African breweries. I worked for an amazing boss, Norman Adamy, who was the CEO of South African breweries. He had a guy called Charlie Furnett, who was the ex-global CMO of Coca-Cola, who was the most incredible marketeer that I've ever come across. I still keep in touch with Charlie. And he also had McKinsey over from the US to help on developing strategy for their brand portfolio at South African breweries. And my time of arrival in there in 2012, purely coincidentally, coincided with the alignment of Charlie coming in as a consultant with McKinsey to develop this strategy for the brands. So I was working on the Castle Lager portfolio, particularly a ailing brand called Castle Light that at the time was declining big time. And they brought in so much process analytical rigor and strategic thinking in the McKinsey model that made a brand so watertight in its strategy that it gave me the confidence to be able to challenge anybody on the strategy and the vision that we had for that brand and that brand portfolio. But it was purely based on objective data, where, as the McKinsey way, they talk about peeling back the onion, the why you're doing this, why is your priority like this? And being able to answer the why to the why to the why until you've reached that finite point in time as to your strategy and your priority makes sense, and that you've exhausted any challenge that could be put against that priority through the questioning that's gone through it. So it was an incredibly rigorous analytical process. And I'm not exaggerating to say that it took, I think, 3 to 4 months in developing a strategy on an annual basis for each brand in that portfolio. And that included a team of 2 McKinsey analysts, a McKinsey engagement manager, myself, my own analytical leads, and my team, my strategy lead, to get a brand to a place and time where the strategy was so tight that we felt confident enough to challenge anybody who would want to challenge it. And I was very much challenged by Norman Adamy, who was a brilliant CEO and incredibly intelligent. And to be able to defend that through an objective-driven strategy was something that I have taken with me forward in my career over the last 15 years, and something that I've actually implemented here on Google, which is to make a more robust strategy for our own products with our own clients to a much greater degree than I think is probably the norm from what I've seen elsewhere.
You mentioned Charlie Burnett there, and you talked about him being a great marketer. What do you think it is that makes somebody a great marketer and really stands out and adds that value?
The CMO role is constantly changing. I think if we'd had this conversation, Matthew, this time last year, I'd probably give you a very different answer. The days of, I'm trying to think of that series with the ad men from the 1960s, of developing ads for above the line that would go on TV and that being perceived as marketing are well and truly gone. The marketers of today need to have multiple skills. The first part is, and it's still very important, I feel, is that human intuition, creative thought process. You need to have that creative agility to understand when an idea, when it's brought to life, how it's going to emotionally connect with your consumers. If you only have intrinsic value of your brand, talking about its taste or its smell, without any emotional quotient, you're going to truly struggle. I mean, that's still the area of creativity that, for example, AI is going to struggle to ever match. And that's the very strong human component. So the creativity area is still there. The area that I think has been very much underappreciated and underdelivered with many marketeers, I would say probably twofold. Firstly, the strategic component. And we just spent a few minutes going through how rigorous the strategy component was for my time in SAB Miller. And the third area that is becoming more and more to the fore within this world of AI is the ability to use technology to adapt and drive efficiencies, both back end and front end, through artificial intelligence and all the products that come from that. And that's a new muscle that I think many marketers are only starting to flex now. And I talk about back end, I talk about front end. The back end, it's the whole efficiency, for example, of brief creation, of insight generation, marketers these days need to understand how to use data, how to use their data, how to use third-party data to truly unearth insights that will be relevant for their brand. The efficiencies of I mentioned developing briefs, of media planning. There's huge cost savings there on AI that they need to understand to be able to direct their teams or specific people to drive that efficiency for the business. Then on the front end, once you have idea generation and insight generation, there is that ability through AI to be very much at the forefront of what's popping within culture today. Is then that ability to generate mass copy. And we're talking about stills, images, video, audio, and hyper-personalized at scale to consumers. So that's nearly a vicious flywheel. Insight generation, content creation, hyper-personalization. Marketers need to understand that, need to understand the nuance, need to understand how to use prompts to generate the right information. And then obviously as well to have that overview and overseeing to ensure that hallucinations aren't being generated, to ensure that you're on copy and on guidelines of the guardrails of your brand look and feel. But that's where AI is very much now at the forefront of what marketers have to deliver moving forward to deliver that flywheel. And then obviously to deliver efficiencies and more higher yields for their businesses. And this is something that also I think is important to mention, that nearly 80% of consumers now expect personalized advertising. So the days of a generic message are long gone. That's why I struggle when I see a lot of these larger brands, for example, FIFA World Cup, spending hundreds of millions of dollars on generic messaging in certain cases. Other clients take that tentpole of, say, FIFA World Cup, but then they can deliver a more personalized, hyper-personalized for their specific brand based on their CRM, first-party data knowledge of behaviors, signals, intent, likes of their consumers, pre-purchases. So I think it's very much in its infancy, but this world of how the marketeer has to operate is changing at such a fast speed. It's quite incredible.
How much of the value add do you think comes from getting that personalization, hyper-personalization at scale, using these tools, using AI, versus avoiding the maybe kind of value destructive sort of advertising, which is super, super generic, not personalized, and doesn't really meet expectations?
Well, there are many tools now, and there are third-party tools, and Meta, TikTok, Google, we all have our own internal tools, but I try to defer more to the external, otherwise you get accused sometimes of grading your own homework, right? I remember as a kid, 6 TV channels. Sometimes I'd be home in the morning, you'd see an ad for a beer. I'm a 9-year-old kid, 11 a.m. in the morning, or even a Saturday morning, during a TV program for the cartoons section, and you're seeing that ad for washing powder. I remember even thinking then, why am I seeing that ad? You're waiting for the toys ad to come on. The amount of waste in terms of wrong message to the wrong person at the wrong time. And then secondly, particularly with old school TV, the level of frequency. Typically to resonate, have an ad resonate, if you get that emotional component with the intrinsic done correctly, the frequency of anywhere between 3 to 5 is a good frequency for that message to be resonated. Many TV buyers for brands have a frequency of 20 to 30. Think about when you're watching TV, how often do you see that same commercial? So the amount of waste that goes in with generic messaging that may only appeal to 15% of the watching audience who've seen that same commercial with a waste of over 20 times is astronomical. And I think that's the beauty of digital marketing, where through attribution, you can actually track who has seen an ad, who's stayed to watch that ad, And has it had any subsequent conversion effect? Have they clicked on the homepage? Have they gone to Google search to go and search that product? Have they watched a video on YouTube? Have they gone to Meta and clicked on something to go and buy? So the attributional component that digital marketing provides these days is of huge value to brands and retailers.
When you look at that differences between Western countries and emerging markets in different areas of the world, and in the context of digital marketing, how different is the approach? Is there a different level of personalization expected? Maybe because consumers are less used to a certain type of advertising, or can you just walk me through how that works?
Sure. Look, I could probably see that differential being most stark with my last job when I was managing Google Mexico versus my new job where I'm back in the US in Chicago working in US business. It's a lot depends on not just the maturity of the consumer, but also the maturity of the companies they are working with. They probably go hand in hand. So I've been struck, even internally, the level of knowledge of the Googlers who manage the same brands in the US vis-a-vis Mexico is quite large. They're more here, the internal Googlers are more sophisticated. They probably know the product to a great degree, YouTube, search, measurement, because their clients are more demanding. Coke, Starbucks, McDonald's of this world are more demanding. And in turn, because their consumers are more demanding. So in Latin America, as an example, I think there's still a lot more license and leeway to be a bit more old school in many approaches because just the market is less mature. Consumers are not as savvy in many ways when it comes to digital tools. Now that's changing very rapidly. If you look at mobile penetration, for example, in Mexico, it's in the high 80s. So it's changing rapidly, but there is still, for example, you bring it into e-commerce, you bring it into agentic commerce, its adoption would be a lot faster, and that flywheel is spinning much more with much higher velocity in the US than it would be in Latin America. And that in turn then puts the onus on clients to satisfy those needs, to be a lot more agile and a lot more competitive in their use of digital tools to ensure that their clients are getting the best user experience possible.
I know we talk about it in this kind of trickle down sense, in that, the development on the marketing front happens generally in these more developed economies and then goes towards the emerging ones. But is there any examples throughout your career of a marketing technique or strategy being piloted or just used to great effect in one of these emerging markets and then brought actually into a more developed market and seeing great success?
Sure, yeah. I mean, in many cases, I think when it comes to innovation, very often innovation is easier to drive in developing markets versus, say, the US. If you try to be innovative in the US, you're betting the farm, right? You're betting the farm, your investment levels are huge. If you do a pilot in a country like Peru, your risk factor is much lower because you're innovating and risking against a much smaller population, right? So I have seen multiple examples of fantastic creative and innovative ideas coming from developed markets. Two I would mention. One would be in South Africa. Castle Light adopted the coldest beer strategy. This worked very well for such a warm climate, a hot climate in the vast majority of South Africa, that they had the coldest fridges, invested in these, fridges that brought the beer temperature just above freezing. So it was -1, -2 versus regular fridges +3. They brought in cold technology. And then they activated that. They brought Drake down, who at the time was just an emerging artist from Canada. And he did a concert where it was for 10,000 people, that the whole concert venue was draped in ice cold look and feel. false snow. They brought the brand to life in a way that Drake said that he had never seen a concert so affiliated to a brand as he had in that time in South Africa. So I think it showed how you can bring brand values to life in a way that can be very, very innovative. More recently, in Mexico, on the digital side, a large soft drinks company were struggling to understand their sales out of the large retail stores. So imagine a retail mom and pop chain where they implemented a digital out of home. So basically screens in store that were able to geolocate consumers who were logged into the app. They had all the information of those consumers, previous purchases, behaviors, and were able to change the message on the out of home screen based on that person who was next in line. So if you were somebody who would purchase, making this up, Pepsi Black, and you had previous purchases through their CRM database, as you're lining up, it would say, hey, there's a promotion on Pepsi Black, buy 3 for the price of 2 or something. So that was very innovative, using geolocation and consumer behaviors to inform digital out of home in store and drive a lot of incremental sales. That's something which started in Mexico, which is now being looked at for this specific brand in the United States.
Wonderful. And I guess on that frontier market element, when you're operating in Latin America, for example, and you hear a lot about Chinese companies and Chinese infrastructure through Belt and Road Initiative, how different is the approach of Chinese or non-Western companies to marketing to that of maybe you at Google? Is that something noticeable to you?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen it more on the retail side. So you look at Shein and Temu. I don't know if you have them in Ireland. They've been incredibly aggressive taking on Amazon. In Latin America, Mercado Libre has been the default big online e-commerce portal in Latin America. They tend to come in using a lot of their strengths, which are traditionally across price and delivery. They will undercut their markets, particularly on things like clothing, electronics. They'll undercut Mercado Libre and Amazon by huge margins. And they're more than willing to be loss leaders for a couple of years to try to gain market share. So they will spend tons of money, for example, on app install campaigns, try to get the Shein or the Temu app downloaded, and then incentivize hugely on discounts to try to get that flywheel moving for people to start interacting with their app and start transacting. Typically, they have very high rotation rates because in very many cases, the quality of product would not be at the same level as you would find elsewhere from Amazon or Mercado Libre, but they just play numbers games. So the actual number of apps that are being installed, and then you have to move very much away from just app installs to what, for example, a KPI in first purchase. If they get that first purchase and if they can maintain those consumers, they will then work a lot on retention campaigns to try to keep those consumers within their portfolio. So it's a very much a price-driven, aggressive strategy to try to take as much share at a loss for a prolonged period of time. We were estimating that one of those brands was losing at about $18 per order in the first year. So if you multiply that out, you can do the math. It's huge losses that they were accumulating, but they were willing to take that hit in order to try to gain a beachhead, drive their awareness, drive usage, and then over time they will try to up-level their consumer base. So it's a very aggressive strategy when it comes to price and utilization.
On the delivery side of things, you mentioned that's one way in which they try to outcompete. Could you just delve a bit more into that?
Yeah. So it's something that what you've seen most of their products originally came from China. So you would order a t-shirt for a kid and it would be, $5. You think, wow, great. I get that from my daughter. The same t-shirt or something very similar is $20 on Amazon. But then you would typically wait 3 weeks for delivery. That was a big pain point for them. So they have been very smart. They've been looking at their hundreds of millions of SKUs and now starting to bulk deliver into warehouses, for example, in Mexico. So those higher rotating products they now have in situ in Mexico to be able to deliver pretty much on par with the likes of Amazon and Mercado Libre, because they have worked out that was the biggest sticking point for consumers to not repurchase, was the delay in delivery. So they just played the numbers game, looked at which SKUs are rotating quickly, which have the highest volume, and then they've been just importing at bulk. So they've worked that strategy out pretty well.
Looking towards the future, in markets which have less data infrastructure, these emerging markets, do you see AI widening the gap there with the developed world or closing it?
That's a great question. I think it depends how we utilize it. It should help us to democratize, in many cases, a proliferation of skills and education, but it has to be done the right way. My hope would be that AI is going to help to educate many areas of particularly more underdeveloped societies, because the appetite is there. If you look at, for example, I always use a proxy, Google career certificates. These are certificates that Google Education makes available for underdeveloped cohorts across Latin America. The utilization rate, when somebody starts a Google certification course, the normal completion rate is about 60-65%. In countries like Mexico, it's about 90-95%. So the appetite to learn is there. The biggest impediment in the past has been access to education at a high quality. When you look at adoption rates of mobile cellular, as I mentioned, 80-85%, we now have the ability for educating many, I'll use the example of Mexico, Mexicans from poorer societies through their phone. And the democratization of AI should mean that you can be educated by the best professor or teacher through AI as your agentic coach or teacher or professor, just as much as a person who comes from a highly privileged background. And that can then be bespoke at your speed of learning, your type of learning, because it can be multimodal. Do you learn more through visual or through numbers or through words, through text? So you can adapt the speed, and because it's going to be interactive, this should really help to close the gap when it comes to educational underdevelopment, particularly on STEM subjects in Latin America and also in Africa.
And I suppose in closing, I know you mentioned at the beginning this period where you were struggling and you realized I needed to make a change and take a bet which might bring you to a different outcome and a better outcome. What advice would you have for those people looking to try and take these asymmetric opportunities in their careers? How best would you identify them, and how would you decide whether or not that's the path to take?
I think a lot depends on each individual's risk tolerance, but my guiding principle has been, when I have felt too comfortable, it's time for a change. So that's something which I think is transferable to anybody. We all get into comfort zones, particularly in the work environment. Secondly, I would seriously consider about how you can or need to differentiate yourself from others. And it also depends on what your next potential move is. If you want to go to do a master's, you want to go to a good business school, for example, one needs to realize that acceptance rates in the likes of Stanford or Harvard or MIT is about 5% up to 8%. So what is your story? What is your narrative that you'll be asked to share that helps differentiate you from your peer set? And that's something that I've always looked at leveraging. So even if you were to take an investment banking or a consulting route, are you working for McKinsey or Bain in London? Great. But could you ask for a secondment or go to work in the McKinsey office in Johannesburg or in Belgrade? Or if you're investment banking, can you go and work in Buenos Aires and, help this whole refinancing of their debt? I'm making this up. But again, thinking in ways outside the box that give you a story that are going to help differentiate you from the 92% of people who are not going to get into that next business school, or to help you get that next position in your organization. So I've always tried to find those ways to pivot from the norm.
I suppose a final quick question just on what you said. How much of the choices you made was trying to get a different story because it was exciting to you versus it was for your career?
One thing that I remember from the provost, the dean of business school, told us on the day of our graduation. He said to us, well, he told us two things. Firstly, always put your family over your work, which sounds quite basic, but actually it's something which very often becomes a challenge for many of us. And the second thing was, he said, follow your passion, or pursue your passion, and the money will follow. And he had seen multiple people going down routes like private equity, being venture capital, purely because they saw it as potential high income earnings in the future, but they detested the industry. And that's something which I've taken very much at heart. I have tried to follow my passion, because I know if I'm working for something and I'm working somewhere that fuels my enthusiasm, fuels my level of inquisitiveness, makes me hungry to learn more about the industry or the country or the vertical or the macroeconomics or political situation, and I have a genuine interest, I know I'm going to thrive and flourish. So it's been driven more by passion with that North Star of wanting to get to where I want to. But I wouldn't say that I've taken deliberate decisions purely based on wanting to be that next level if I felt that it was not going to be a position I'm going to enjoy.
Thank you, Julian, for coming on.
Thank you, Matthew. I enjoyed talking with you, and thanks for the time for your side as well.